Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Roger Zakheim, Director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, the D.C. office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Now, this is that magical time of year in Washington, D.C., when we get to enjoy the few final weeks of cool spring breezes before the summer humidity arrives. And about that time, when the weather heats up, the discussions around the National Defense Authorization Act tend to heat up too. So here at the Reagan Institute, we want to help set the table. Now, 40 years since his inaugural year, President Reagan's vision for foreign policy and national defense continues to resonate. You can almost sum it up in 3 sentences. First, President Reagan clearly understood the importance of principled U.S. leadership in the global competition between free societies and the forces of domination and destruction. 2, President Reagan also understood that the United States is stronger standing with our allies and partners. And finally, President Reagan understood the importance of balancing a strong defense with our commitment to promoting peace. Now, that nice summary is not my words. They're not even a Republican's words. They are the words of today's speaker, who understands the Reagan philosophy of peace through strength as well as anyone. And as the new chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, he is going to be at the center of conversations about the NDAA, budget top lines, and our national defense strategy. So we are honored today to welcome Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island to the Reagan Institute. He's a friend and familiar face, and the recipient of the Ronald Reagan Peace Through Strength Award. In fact, the words I quoted were from his acceptance speech in 2017. Now, President Reagan's view of peace through strength may be understood, even embraced, by some on both sides of the aisle. It has stood the test of time, even as the threats we face have evolved through the decades. So it may seem like conventional wisdom to some. But it's important to remember that these words and these values were not universal in Reagan's day. And they aren't universal values in today's world either. There are still those who would retreat to isolationism. There are those who would even cede military superiority to other powers. There are those who would shred alliances for short-term political gain. Like President Reagan, Senator Reed knows those approaches do not make for a safer America and a more peaceful world. So we're grateful to have him here today, and most important, we're grateful for his leadership in one of the most consequential roles in Congress. With that, Senator, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing your vision of America's defense priorities.
Well, thank you very much, Roger, for that extraordinarily kind introduction. It is a privilege to be here today, and I thank the Reagan Institute for hosting this conversation. On the Armed Services Committee, we are looking at a considerable array of challenges to our national security. As the chairman of the committee, where I enjoy a very close working relationship with Ranking Member Jim Inhofe, we are working in a bipartisan manner to give the department effective tools to address these challenges. I think it's very important to understand the fiscal year 2020 NDAA in the context of this year's defense budget. We are still awaiting the detailed budget request from the Biden administration, but the budget outline released last month recommended that the Defense Department's top line be $715 billion, which is essentially a flat budget. In addition, as many of you know, fiscal year 2022 is the first year in many that we will not be constrained by the Budget Control Act, which creates inherent tensions in Congress. Now, some of my colleagues will argue that the $715 billion top line is too low, while others will argue for more significant reductions. And we will have to see the details of the budget before we begin to understand our path forward. Now, belt tightening in any department is always a challenge, but also provides an opportunity to evaluate what is necessary. This budget will present an opportunity to focus on the critical technologies we need to modernize our forces and maintain our competitive advantage, like AI, quantum computing, and hypersonics. It should also push us into finding ways to retire legacy systems and excess infrastructure that are using up limited resources without providing an added edge. Both the Defense Department and Congress will need to make tough choices this year. Now, in order to determine priorities, we must first look at the challenges we face. We are engaged in a strategic competition with China and Russia, near-peer rivals that do not accept U.S. global leadership or the international norms that have helped keep the peace since before President Reagan's presidency. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines has assessed that the strategic competition is likely to intensify due to, among other things, shifts in the military balance of power and diverging visions of governance models between China and Russia and the West. This strategic competition is unfolding amidst a global pandemic, environmental degradation, and climate change, and disruptive technologies. The interconnected nature of these threats will drive how we resource and transform our tools of national power, not only military, but also diplomatic, economic, and informational. We must respond to these complex security challenges, and we will. The Department of Defense has appropriately identified the Indo-Pacific as its priority theater and China as the pacing threat for the United States military. In the next 10 years, the Indo-Pacific region is projected to generate 2/3 of the global economy and be home to 2/3 of the global population. For the past several decades, China has studied the United States' way of war and focused its efforts on offsetting our advantages. This strategy has been successful largely because China began without any significant legacy systems to maintain and built from the ground up, investing in disruptive technologies like AI, quantum computing, hypersonics, and biotechnology, and stealing enormous amounts of intellectual property from other countries. But despite its impressive military buildup, we must not assume that China is 10 feet tall. In the coming years, China faces a number of challenges, both at home and abroad, including a significantly aging population, a push by Chinese minority groups for humane treatment by the government, and growing distrust and hostility towards China's predatory behavior all around the world. Now, in order to boost our military advantage, the Armed Services Committee created the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or PDI, to better align DoD resources in support of military-to-military partnerships to address the challenges posed by China. PDI will remain a priority for the committee as we seek to provide additional funding for required military capabilities, strategic forward-based military posture, and enhanced training infrastructure and opportunities. I want to emphasize, however, that our nation's edge over China cannot be based on military might alone. We must strengthen our network of partners and allies, which will be central to any strategy for the Indo-Pacific region. I think a doctrine that President Reagan would endorse wholeheartedly. Furthermore, we must use our economic strength and financial levers to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative in regions like Africa and South America. Near-peer competition will require a whole-of-government approach. Turning to Russia, in the post-Cold War era, Russia followed a similar approach to China, heavily investing in emerging technologies like autonomous weapons, hypersonics, and cutting-edge cyber warfare tools, while largely abandoning their arsenal of legacy systems from the Soviet regime. But while Russia's military remains very capable, the country faces enormous difficulties. It is also faced with an aging population, an increasingly authoritarian government, and a struggling economy estimated to have shrunk by 4.3% in 2020. And as more of the world's economy moves from hydrocarbons to alternate fuels, Russia's economic foundation will be further threatened. Russia is not in a position to directly confront the United States militarily. The Kremlin knows this, however, and has therefore focused on continuing to harass the United States and other countries with hybrid warfare. This warfare, which stays just below the threshold of provoking a military response, includes disinformation campaigns, targeting democratic processes, cyber espionage, and the continued use of proxy groups to further Russian interest in numerous countries around the world. Such gray zone activities are unfortunately here to stay and will also require a whole of government effort to counteract. The Defense Department knows the challenges before it and needs to have the right tools and processes to meet those challenges. There are several areas that, if transformed, could allow the Department of Defense to use its funds more effectively and prepare more efficiently for near-peer competition. I believe that one key factor that makes the United States military the greatest in the world is that it is a volunteer force. We need to ensure that our uniformed personnel know how much we appreciate what they do. Now, Congress has tried and I think done a good job overall in providing benefits for the military and their families, and we will continue to do that. But a recent trip I took to Fort Hood with Senator Inhofe deepened my concern about the cohesion of the force. Our military is showing the strain of 2 decades of continuous deployments. As a sergeant major indicated to me, the commanders do not know their troops, and the troops do not trust their commanders. And issues such as racism, extremism, sexual harassment, and sexual assault have been allowed to fester and create friction and division. Secretary Austin is tackling these issues head on, and I will work to see that the committee helps him in these areas. Supporting the military are thousands of civilian personnel who have been demoralized over the past several years by a lack of leaders in key roles, lack of opportunity for professional growth, hiring caps, and pay freezes. The committee needs to find ways to restore the health of the civilian workforce, which is critical to the department's success. Now, one of the less glamorous subjects the committee has been looking at is the PPBE, or Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution process. If you can find a more boring topic, please contact me immediately. It focuses on the financial management and resource allocation for current and future defense acquisition programs. As many of you know, this is largely a process unchanged from 1961 when Secretary Robert McNamara and the Whiz kids put it in place. Today, however, it is likely too slow and cumbersome to meet many of DoD's requirements to adopt new technologies in a rapid, agile manner and needs to be updated. Again, it is one of those aspects that gets little attention but has extraordinary impact on our ability to be competitive in this very challenging world. Another issue the committee has been looking at is management transformation. With one of the largest bureaucracies in the world, management is critical. The Government Accountability Office has put DoD's approach to business transformation on its high-risk list, citing its vulnerability to waste, fraud, and abuse, inability to pass a financial audit, and a culture that remains resistant to change. We need to transform these management practices by growing cultural buy-in from senior leaders, hiring personnel with the right skill sets, investing in IT modernization, and encouraging innovation in the bureaucracy. We also need to do better at collecting and analyzing data to improve business and management decisions. At the end of the day, we should think about management as a defense capability like any other. Another continuing task of the committee is to oversee the ongoing reforms of the DoD acquisition process. The Pentagon's procurement processes must adapt to move at the speed of changing technologies and threats. We should continue to streamline the procurement process to be less complex and allow smaller companies and agile businesses to better compete and offer new ideas and technologies. Congress and DoD must work to find the right balance of speed, technical rigor, and oversight in acquisition processes. Recent NDAAs and the new DoD policies have created many new, faster acquisition pathways. We need to continue to work with the Pentagon to use and refine these processes and procedures and to create incentives for big DoD programs to embrace and adopt disruptive technology. And perhaps most importantly, we need to give DoD time to absorb the large number of acquisition changes recently made and adjust its practices as we discover what does and what does not work. Now, some of the specific threats that we face are obviously in the realm of cybersecurity. As the recent solar winds Microsoft Exchange and Colonial Pipeline's server breaches painfully illustrate traditional perimeter-based defenses are simply inadequate to deal with sophisticated threats. Our adversaries are clearly advantaged in the cyber domain and are likely to succeed in penetrating static defenses. Experts in cybersecurity have been urging leaders in industry and government to augment perimeter defenses with what is called a zero trust model. Zero trust means what the name implies. We must assume that adversaries are inside our networks at all times and that no one moving around in our networks should be trusted. In practice, this means checking on the behavior of every person and device on the network, constantly challenging them to authenticate their identity and accesses. DoD has been working on elements of this zero trust model for some time. Now we need to expand and accelerate these activities. Also among the emerging threats is, in addition to cyber or other aspects of cyber, is climate change and extreme weather. They've already cost the DoD billions of dollars in installation damages and will increasingly impact readiness and geopolitical tensions around the world. Just like any other threat, DoD must better prepare for the impacts of environmental degradation. A reasonable first step would be the adoption of distributed and renewable energy sources. Not only do these energy sources enhance the combat capability of warfighters, they save DoD money that can be spent on training and readiness. And this year there will be certainly a debate about the modernization of the nuclear triad because of the course and a genuine disagreement about our nation's nuclear policy. From my perspective, nuclear deterrence is the bedrock of our national defense. For our nuclear deterrent to be credible and to ensure these weapons never need to be used, they must always be capable and ready for use. Our allies and partners depend on the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and modernization of our strategic forces is needed to reassure them of our dependability. Doubt about the reliability of the U.S. nuclear umbrella could contribute to greater proliferation. One thing I think everyone would agree on, and I think often gets lost in the discussion, is the fact that arms control and the modernization of our nuclear forces are inherently linked together. Even as we modernize, we should seek ways to promote strategic stability, like the extension of the New START agreement and follow-on talks to cover new strategic weapons and further reduce nuclear stockpiles. The best way to reduce nuclear weapons is through negotiated arms control. Finally, while I have spent most of my time speaking about future challenges and how we transform the department to face them, the department and the committee cannot lose sight of present challenges, the key one being the withdrawal from Afghanistan. As you know, President Biden recently announced the departure of all forces from Afghanistan by September. The president's decision should be seen as a transition, not closure. We still have vital security issues in the region, and the United States must continue to ensure that Afghanistan will not become a safe haven for terrorism and do all we can to empower the legitimate government of Afghanistan. We must learn from the past and maintain an agile posture in the region to prevent a scenario similar to the rise of ISIS following our exit in Iraq. In closing, when I was growing up, and I'm still trying to grow up, the conclusion that the Soviet Union would reach its full military and economic potential appeared all but certain. Armed conflict seemed to be not a question of if, but when. But because of the resolute, careful decision by the leaders of both parties, particularly President Reagan, coming together in the interest of the nation and the world, we prevailed and the Soviet Union collapsed. We currently live in a global security environment even more complex than that of the Cold War, but I am confident that we have the resources and abilities we need to not only outlast this long-term strategic competition, but to be better for it. Thank you again to the Reagan Institute for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you today, and I welcome the opportunity to talk with Roger. Thank you.
The virtual applause are going off. I don't know if you can hear them, but Senator, thank you so much for those comprehensive remarks. Really making this conversation easy. You gave covered a lot of ground, and I guess I'll just start with you as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. the budget, the full budget, hasn't arrived.
Right.
As you mentioned, the so-called skinny budget.
Yeah.
Somewhat ironic when you deal with a $15 billion budget to call it skinny. How is that impacting the work of the Senate Armed Services Committee in particular? Is this going to force us into another continuing resolution? Do you think you can get a conference report finished before the end of the fiscal year? I know you want to mark up sometime in July.
Right. Well, Roger, that's our intention, and both Senator Inhofe and I are determined to get our bill to the floor and then get the conference done and get a bill to the President's desk. I think what we found is that there are many who would like to see an increase in the budget along the lines of 3.5%, and then there are others who would like to see steep reductions. We've hit a point, I think, that we can manage. It's going to be difficult. As I mentioned, we're going to have to make some hard choices, but our intention is to get the bill done and to do so in a way that enhances our security.
Yeah, and I want to go to the budget in a second, but we had Chairman Smith here, your counterpart in the House Armed Services Committee, one that I have some allegiance to, given my own past.
No?
And he said that he's been pushing the White House to provide the budget. He said that they're not answering his calls, and he really wants to press on the urgency of getting this full budget,
Yeah.
so that his committee and your committee can really weigh the full request and incorporate it in the NDA. Is the White House answering your calls?
Adam is such a great advocate that I delegated responsibility.
He's like the offensive lineman here?
I'm just sitting in the back kind of with a sort of sinister smile. No. The problem you grasp immediately is the longer we're delayed, the less opportunity you have to work out very complicated issues. They're more complicated because there's not the same growth that we saw in the last few years. I mean, ironically, the last several years, the money has not been the issue. The issue has been other factors. And the irony of all this is the Budget Control Act started off really imposing significant costs on DOD. The sequestration was a disaster. But as it evolved, it actually pushed up both the defense and the domestic numbers because one side was competing against the other, and so that was not a factor. Today it's a factor. We don't have that any longer.
Let's move to strategy,
Right.
which of course you hit on at the outset of your remarks. And as I imagine, the big four, which are the chairs of the Armed Services Committee and the ranking members coming together, you have a couple different perspectives here.
We do.
Senator Inhofe wrote in an op-ed that our budget must match our strategy. That's Budgeting 101. And his assumption about the strategies he likes to wave is the National Defense Strategy. You've seen him wave it on occasion, haven't you?
Yes.
And it's actually the Defense Strategy Commission, which I'm somewhat I like. But that's his view. And then we had Adam Smith, who was sitting where you were not too long ago, and he says, our current National Defense Strategy, the one that Senator Inhofe likes to wave, is too big, too ambitious, and too unrealistic in terms of what our needs are. What is your view in terms of the defense strategy as it stands today? You have the interim guidance from the administration, which isn't a full treatment of national defense.
No.
Is it your thinking that the previous defense strategy was too ambitious and therefore the resources were too much?
First of all, I think the strategy is evolving, as it always does, based on changes in the threat, based on changes in the environment. That's happening constantly. I think the other factor, though, is we need a national security strategy which would embrace the national defense strategy. And I think we were not relying on a national security strategy. We weren't relying on diplomacy. We weren't relying upon economic engagement. We weren't relying upon a lot of things. It was just simply saying we're going to build a military force that will handle all our problems. And that's not, I think, appropriate. Not only is it's unrealistic also. So now I think we're looking to see with this budget is what's necessary. And I think we're going to have to make difficult choices, but every year, the Pentagon will send up requests to cut funding, and in fact, Congress sometimes doesn't respond to those requests. And those are the professionals saying, we don't need this. I think in this context, we're going to have to pay more attention to their advice.
So I want to get to that in a second because that is kind of a euphemism for these so-called legacy systems.
Yes.
But one thing on the defense strategy, which seemed to be where Chairman Adam Smith was going, was a strategy that seeks the United States to really lead and provide security in 3 regions of the world, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, may be too much to ask for. The previous national security strategy and, of course, the national defense strategy certainly took the view that we needed to be able, that as the United States, to deter and assure in those 3 regions of the world as well as elsewhere. Do you feel that the Middle East is in particular a region that the United States military is too focused on, or do you think that we have the balance right?
No, I think since our invasion of Afghanistan, and particularly since the invasion of Iraq, we have been into an area which has been very costly to us, both in lives and in resources. And we have to move out, not physically and completely, but redirect our focus. The president did that with his decision, which was previewed by President Trump, of pulling forces out of Afghanistan. I think we'd like to see, and we're seeing some progress in Iraq, but typically, the military looks at threats and would like to be able to handle every threat possible. But in practice, it's been my experience that essentially you pick a priority and the rest is economy of force. That's exactly what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Once they decided to go into Iraq, Afghanistan was economy of force. We lost a lot of momentum. In fact, it might be one of the major factors contributing to our lack of success in many dimensions over there. But that's been, I think, history. So we understand that they would like, okay, I want to have be able to it used to be the 2-war concept.
Right.
And that was sort of dropped when they realized we don't do that anyway. You take the most serious threat and you focus your attention on that.
Prevail in one, and then you have deterrence in the other. But just to put a finer point on this Middle East point, because it keeps on surfacing in many respects, because in people's minds, if we're out of Iraq, we'll pull out of Afghanistan, does that mean we're going to be out of the Middle East and greater Middle East? You've said in your remarks that we need to maintain an agile posture. By that I mean, okay, well, our 5th Fleet, our air bases in the region become more pivotal, that is in the Middle East, in order to carry out the, let's say, counterterrorism and intelligence missions that you otherwise would do if you had a presence in Afghanistan and elsewhere.
No, I mean, as I suggested in my comments about Afghanistan, it's not closure. It's not we're coming back, et cetera. It's transitional, and you're right. We have to have presence there, but the presence is more of an overwatch than engagement with troops on the ground in many locations.
Sure, certainly hostilities or active operations.
And also, we have to supplement that again with a national strategy with diplomacy to see if, and you're beginning to hear things where the Saudis are considering discussions with the Iranians, and maybe that's a function of they've understood that we're not there to be the buffer between the two, so they have to work something out. But we have to encourage that type of dialogue.
Well, since you mentioned Iran, I mean, what is your view in terms of how the military ought to posture itself as the Biden administration seeks to either resurrect the JCPOA or come up with some sort of new deal and address the Iranian nuclear program through diplomacy?
No, I think we have to, as you mentioned, the 5th Fleet in Bahrain, and one of the key factors is the rights of international navigation through international waters. That is something we cannot ignore, and we have to be the one, in fact, that probably the strongest protector of those rights in the region. That gives us not only a rationale, but a compelling reason to be there. Then I think we have to make it clear that we will not tolerate the malign activities of the Iranians, and at the same time, and it's not unusual, have a dual track where we're talking about seriously, basically an arms control agreement again with establishing something like the PCLB.
Okay, let's go back to the NDAA, and you went through a bunch of priorities. Super interesting. Let's start with the one we just mentioned a moment ago: legacy systems. The administration's interim national security guidance, which is is perhaps a preface to what will be their national security strategy, didn't have a lot of treatment on defense, but it did call out legacy systems as something it wanted to see the Pentagon taking on and removing. A moment ago you said, well, the Congress often has been the hurdle in realizing that. Is there any low-hanging fruit as you look at your professional staff and say, okay, that's a legacy system, we can all agree ought to go?
I think, frankly, we're waiting to see what the Pentagon sends over because we want to give them not only the deference they deserve, but
Sure.
also what we might think for other reasons they don't think. And it's nice to begin with at least their imprimatur that this is something we can look at.
Right.
And then we get into significant issues with the politics of ending anything. And regardless of defense, go to any federal agency and try to terminate a program. It's tough.
Yeah, and Chairman Smith said the same thing, and oftentimes, one person's view of a legacy system, depending on the strategy or the theater, becomes something that's of critical importance, and there's no other replacement capability.
Well, I mean, we have got a pretty good legacy system in the B-52, and no one's thinking about taking that out because, frankly, we're extending its life because it's thank God for those engineers then back in the 1950s that thought about it. I'm told they started on a napkin and figured, let's build
and generations later, it's still
yeah.
being used.
I mean, yes. So, again, we have to look very carefully. And your point is very well taken. What's the threat? What's the strategy? One example for this is when we went into Afghanistan, we didn't have the kind of protection for our troops against IEDs that
Sure.
we needed. And Bob Gates, to his credit, said, let's build all these armored vehicles,
The MRAPs.
MRAPs, et cetera. We don't need those in a fight in the Pacific like we did in Afghanistan. So, but those systems, because it was so obvious they weren't needed, are no longer being purchased.
And that really gets a critical point because you mentioned throughout your speech how China is the pacing threat, how we're in this period of competition, truly a mark of bipartisanship and nonpartisan issue. So it's a consensus around that. And you also mentioned PDI, which is the Specific Deterrence Initiative, which the Congress led on and really charged the previous administration to take on. Do you feel that the military and the Pentagon more broadly has a clear set of the types of platforms and capabilities required to really carry out a concept of operations so we could feel confident we could prevail in a hot scenario or deter effectively?
Well, I think first of all, what they're doing is tailoring their existing systems to be capable of that fight, and then looking ahead to what better systems we can have. I think the key linkage is communications, uninterrupted, encrypted communications, so that we can command these elements. When I was in the Army back in the 70s, basically it was
Sounds better than the last century.
I know. It's the last sentence. Yes, that's right. It was shoot, move, and communicate.
Right.
I think right now it's communicate so you can shoot and move. And I think our adversaries, the Chinese particularly, understand this. So one of the big platforms we need is not necessarily a fighter aircraft or a carrier or a new troop carrier. We need the complete uninterruptible connectivity. That it involves space, it involves technologies, it involves adapting. My sense is that in the first stages of any fight against any serious opponent they'll try to take out our commo, our space.
Sure.
And so we have to have a way to get around that, and we have to start thinking of that.
And have the communication at the edge, right? Not so you're drawing back, to the base or elsewhere.
No, you've got to be, the way we outmaneuver and outfight the opponent is to be able to be 1 or 2 steps ahead of them. That implies you can instantaneously communicate, move, shoot, etc.
That technology you described as an example of the type of technologies you referenced in your speech, right? These cutting-edge technologies, perhaps disruptive technologies. One thing that caught my ear in those remarks is that our acquisition processes need to have kind of a pathway for integrating them.
That's right.
Made me think of the much coveted program of record.
Yeah.
Do you think our programs of record, is this what you mean by, in your remarks, are agile enough, are responding enough to incorporate the types of technologies that you've outlined today as a key policy priority area for the Senate Armed Services Committee?
I frankly don't think so, and that's not because of the misjudgment or inertia of Department of Defense. It's as much cultural and it's as much institutional as anything else. Again, these systems came in basically PPBE in the 1960s, when in an industrial society that was the most sophisticated way to manage a big organization. McNamara came out of Ford.
Right.
He was a young guy with his whiz kids, and they transformed the Department of Defense, and we were able to leap ahead of the Soviets because of it. But I think now, when you have a situation where computer technology, software is probably more decisive than hardware in many cases as it quickly adapts, we have to move to a new model, a post-industrial age model. And that's why we're looking seriously at the PPBE. We want expert opinion. We want to make sure that the changes we make are consistent with the new technology.
Well, there's definitely one viewer who is a friend of yours and is a family relation of mine who is really enjoying your focus on the PPBE, which probably the one thing he disagreed with in your speech is that you called that the most boring subject.
No.
But a former comptroller probably is excited about that.
He added the E.
There, it
used to go PPB
right.
until your
execution.
Father added the E.
There we go.
Execution. And he would like, no surprise, more E. That's all he wants.
More E.
He wants more E. Okay.
But on the execution side, I mean, do you think that the department has enough authority, has enough law to actually make sure that the future programs of record are incorporating the software as much as the hardware, or is it something that an NDA needs to address in kind of black letter?
I think we've, and as Davy Crockett said, or at least Vess Parker, be sure you're right, then go ahead. I think we're looking at it very closely to make sure we're right. There's a lot, I'm sure, that can be done within the Department of Defense and the regular, as your father did with respect to the putting the execution phase in. There's a lot to be done. But what we're doing is trying to focus this issue so that DOD says this is important with Congress, so maybe we'll start looking clearly, and then together we could hopefully come to a juncture in the future.
So a bit of oversight and focus could go a long way here.
Yeah.
One thing when we deal with top lines that are putting pressure on the department, right? $7 to $15 billion, a lot of money, but as you noted, it's not real growth. It's not keeping pace with inflation.
Right.
I think you set up the budget debate quite right. There are those who want 3 to 5% growth, and there are those who colleagues of yours in the Senate who want to see significant cuts. One thing that happens in this environment is real competition between military departments, right, and between the services. Right. The Navy clearly has a very important mission as we shift to Asia and focus on China. What's your reaction to the advocates of we need this many hundred ships, 355, or the previous administration wanted to get over 400.
Right.
Is that something you think is a good framework for approaching what's required, or do you take a different way of
No, I think in many cases it's arbitrary.
It's arbitrary.
It just sends a signal that we're going to have this so many of aircraft or ships, et cetera, rather than look at the threat, look at the what capabilities you need. Again, a more sophisticated computer software on some ships might make them more capable than adding an identical ship with the old design. So we have to look that way. And I think also, too, in terms of these numbers, one of the things, and I think Secretary Esper tried to emphasize this when he talked about his number, was we have to move more to autonomous vehicles. And particularly surface vehicles and subsurface vehicles, because one, I remember what Dave Petraeus said, don't send a soldier where you can send a bullet. Well, don't send a manned vessel
System,
where
right.
you can that are an autonomous vehicle. And I think that would actually be able to be cheaper in many respects and also be more destabilizing to our opponents who now see not just X number but 10X.
Swarming vessels, swarming aircraft and the
Yeah.
like. You know, it goes back to something you were saying earlier when you were talking about the budget, is you want to see investment in these technologies. Do you have a metric for that? I mean, is it dollars? I mean, you could look at the defense budget and you could say the following, right? The amount of time people speak about AI and they speak about machine learning and robotics relative to the dollars, it's entirely disproportionate.
I know. I think that, first of all, we require a coordinated effort within the government, not just Department of Defense. It transcends all of the government. A lot of it is going to be academic research because that's where you find most of the scholars that are looking at these issues. So we have to pull together, I think, a comprehensive national program that would emphasize much more so AI and not just verbiage rather, but actually putting the resources there. And we're going to be in a situation, I think, where some good ideas don't pan out,
Sure.
and some, that's the breakthrough. I mean, one of the areas is it's somewhat relevant is that our genome project. You know, we put resources into NIH, we're looking for the breakthrough, and then it came. Right. And now we've got this incredible genomic inventory of drugs and of medical assistance that came with basically saying, this is a problem, we want to tackle it, and we've got robust resources to do it.
And certainly the R&D and the basic R&D is a key area of government spending that benefits, you know,
it benefits
the entire country. All
it does,
aspects.
but this is one of those things where it's NSF spending, it's even to some degree, it's the other agencies that might have research going on that contributes to this, and it's a private enterprise in the United States.
Now, the challenge, of course, and then we got a few minutes, want to hit on Taiwan and some of the measures going through the Congress right now, is you got pressure to pull out legacy systems, right? Budget pressure, strategic, you know, priority, and then you want to integrate these new technologies, and oftentimes there's a gap. And I think a mistake we made in the past, and I don't know your sense of whether or not it's going to be an issue front and center for you, is you remove the legacy system, you have a capability gap, and you're waiting. You're waiting for the system to replace it with a new technology, but you only see it on a piece of paper. You know, it's not actually there. I mean, how are you kind of thinking about that, and is that something the committee will closely make sure that we're not left in this period of competition with China where we have years without the capability because we did a cost-cutting measure?
I think basically that's why you just don't want to do random cost-cutting. Like they said, you want a transition plan from, you know, the existing system to the next, and that depends upon when the new platform's arriving, the life expectancy of the existing platform. Do you have to invest some money to extend life on that aspect? There are other ways to cover it. And again, I think trying to break through is let's think more about autonomy rather than, we've got another system coming on, manned system, et cetera. And again, that's what we're trying to look for.
Yeah, big emphasis on autonomy. I want to move to kind of just the geopolitical challenges we find ourselves facing right now. Admiral Davidson, of course, testified before the House Armed Services Committee in March saying that Taiwan is clearly one of China's ambitions, and I think that threat is manifest during this decade, in fact, in the next 6 years. Right. I'm curious to get your view of, are we postured in a fashion that we could prevent a Taiwan flare-up within the next 6 years, and what else do we need to do here?
Well, I think we are very conscious, as Admiral Davidson expressed, of the changing dynamic, and it's been changing over the last decade or more with respect to Taiwan. And I think one of the wake-up calls was what happened in Hong Kong, which I assumed at least, would be eventually included more decisively within the People's Republic, but was done so very dramatically. That, I think, has got us all sort of very, very keen.
Pretty brazen. I mean, really brazen.
Exactly. And We have to be much more concerned. And we are adapting. Talking to Admiral Davidson himself, other commanders in the Pacific, we're adapting. New strategy, new requests for platforms that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we didn't think we need. Again, because we were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were building MRAPs, not
right.
vehicles for the Pacific or platform specific. So I think we recognize this. The other factor too is, and I think this goes back to the whole of government, the national security, not just defense issues, is that engaging our neighbors, the Quad, for example, more actively and having them...
India, Japan, Australia.
Exactly, South Korea. Having them engage with us on a very practical basis sends a signal to the Chinese, who have very few, if any, real allies,
right.
that they're not going to just confront the United States alone. They're going to confront a unified group of countries. And then there are other factors that we have to weigh and they have to weigh. I mean, their economy is based on trade with the United States and the European Union and everyone else. What happens if they take a step that the whole world condemns and deems as being beyond...
Being an international provider, I mean, that is an important distinction perhaps between China and Russia. Russia is a sanctioned country, and so they engage in land grabs and the like. And China, certainly has the trade there, the Winter Olympics. I mean, they have to be mindful of how they're perceived. Yet, real concerns in terms of their actions and
absolutely.
human rights to security.
No, absolutely. And with respect to Taiwan too, is part of our effort should be to enable them to be much more effective in defending themselves. Again, there's no comparison between the PLA and the forces that the Taiwanese can marshal. But if the island is much more resilient on its own terms, not without, that is another deterrence to the Chinese doing something rash.
Last question before we have to wrap up, but it deals with domestic spending, but is tied to this discussion vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. Taking all the COVID bills, the infrastructure bills, and other measures that the Biden administration is putting forward, it could add up to over $6 trillion of spending. None of it that would include defense. Is there an infrastructure component here that could actually benefit the defense industrial base, perhaps the semiconductors, if we appropriate for the CHIPS Act?
I think the semiconductors would be an obvious benefit, but one is less obvious, but I think will contribute, is that some of these programs that the president is espousing, I think recognizing that we've passed the industrial age. We are now in an information age, and more education and more training is going to be the decisive difference between our success or failure. So when you're talking about things that seem to have no application to defense, like preschool and child care, so that our most creative people can work because they're not at home caring for children. When you talk about 2 years of post-high school education, which could lead and probably will lead to 4 years and maybe more, we're going to go back to a situation where, like the good old days, where America was the most highly educated country in the world, and China was just struggling to come out of, the century of shame and being overrun by foreign powers and et cetera. And that's one of the factors that help move them, and that's one of the factors that will help us. So I think these programs, particularly, I think he does recognize in his proposals that the new capital is not just bricks and mortars. It's human intellect. It's advancing. We've been talking about AI. We've been talking about the new economy. I mean, if you look ahead X number of years, robotics are going to take so many jobs. I mean, not all the jobs, but what do we do in place? Well, we get people so that their skills are not simply manual, but they're intellectual, so they can provide content, so they can operate those robots, et cetera, and create things, et cetera. So I think that's absolutely critical. And, a strong American economy with talented people is probably the bulwark of our defense.
No doubt. Economic strength is complements and goes hand in hand with our military strength.
I mean, your analogy with Russia and China, they were never really economically powerful, the Soviets. In fact, they ran an economy that was just dysfunctional in many cases, and it finally collapsed. One of the advantages the Chinese have is they're entrepreneurial. They can do business very well. They're very creative, innovative, and very well educated. That's the source.
Not 10 feet tall, but certainly a challenge.
But that's the source of their now military buildup. They built up their economy, and now they're building up their military.
Senator Reed, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for visiting with us today at the Reagan Institute, and perhaps we'll see you out in Simi Valley, California in December.
I hope so.
All right.
Thank you.